The address glowed wrong on my phone screen, but I was already 20 minutes late, and my manager would dock my pay if I took any longer. So I pushed through the gleaming lobby doors of the high-rise anyway, pizza bags balanced against my hip, the heat seeping through my thin jacket. The doorman barely glanced at me, used to delivery people invading his polished domain, and I slipped into the elevator before he could question whether I belonged in this building, where the monthly rent probably exceeded my yearly income. Floor 28. The hallway smelled like expensive candles and money, thick carpet muffling my worn sneakers, and I checked the receipt again because something fell off, but I was too exhausted to care. 3 jobs and not enough sleep, blurring everything into survival mode. I knocked on 2804, waited, heard movement inside. The door opened and my breath caught because the man standing there was shirtless, all carved muscle and dark ink swirling across his chest and shoulders, and his eyes were gray like winter storms, cold and assessing, and a face too handsome to be safe. He looked annoyed, eyebrows drawn together, mouth set in a hard line. But then his gaze dropped to my hands as I reached for the pizza bags, and everything changed. The air itself shifted. His entire body went still in a way that reminded me of predators on nature documentaries. That focused intensity right before the strike. And I realized he was staring at my wrist where my sleeve had ridden up, exposing the finger-shaped bruises Tyler left last night. Those gray eyes snapped back to my face, and I wanted to run, but my feet would not move. "Who did this to you?" His voice was quiet, controlled, but something deadly moved underneath the calm. I pulled my sleeve down fast, too fast, stammering that it was nothing. I bruised easily. I just needed payment for the pizza. He did not move from the doorway. Did not blink. Asked again who put those marks on me, and I lied. Said I was clumsy, bumped into things. Please, I needed to go. He studied me for a long moment, and I felt stripped bare under that gaze. Like he could see every secret I buried, every excuse I made, every time I covered bruises with makeup and long sleeves. Then he stepped back, pulled out his wallet, handed me bills without counting. Way too much. Easily triple the order cost. Keep it. His voice was softer now, but no less intense. I tried to give back the extra, but he closed my fingers around the money, his hand warm and solid, and careful not to touch the bruises. And then he took the receipt and wrote something on it before handing it back. My personal number. When you are ready. I shook my head, said I did not need anything. Thank you for the tip, and finally my legs remembered how to work. I turned toward the elevator, skin prickling because I knew without looking that he watched me. Felt the weight of his attention like a physical touch. And when the elevator doors finally closed, I sagged against the wall, heart hammering. Something about him terrified me. Something about him felt like salvation. I should throw away the receipt. I tucked it into my pocket instead. The apartment door stuck like it always did, and I had to shoulder it open, the sound loud enough to wake Tyler if he was sleeping. But I found him awake instead, sprawling on our sagging couch with empty beer bottles lined up on the coffee table like soldiers, his eyes tracking me as I entered, and my stomach dropped because I knew that look, that dangerous glassy focus that meant he had been drinking and thinking, and nothing good ever came from that combination. You took forever. His voice was too calm, the kind of calm that preceded storms. I checked the receipt times and my pulse started hammering because I had taken 47 minutes for a delivery that should have been 20. Too long, way too long. And I scrambled for excuses about traffic and wrong addresses, but he was already standing, swaying slightly, closing the distance between us. Who were you with? Nobody. Just deliveries. My manager sent me across town. I tried to keep my voice level and soothing, the tone I used when he got like this. But he grabbed my arm exactly where the bruises already lived, and white-hot pain exploded up to my shoulder. I gasped, could not stop the sound, and something flickered in his eyes. Satisfaction, maybe, before he accused me of cheating, said I smelled different, looked different, was lying to him. I tried to pull away, and he shoved me backward into the kitchen counter, the edge catching my hip bone, and I tasted fear metallic and familiar. He loomed over me, demanding to know who I was seeing, what I was doing, why I was destroying us. And I made myself small, made myself apologize for things I did not do, agree that I should have been faster, promised nothing was wrong, anything to diffuse this. He stared at me for a long moment, and I held my breath. Then he released me with a sound of disgust, and stumbled back to the couch, reaching for another beer. I did not wait to see if his mood would shift again, just walked quickly to the bathroom, locked the door with shaking hands, and slid down to sit on the cold tile floor. Through the thin door, I heard him muttering, then the television blaring too loud. After dinner, I showered, let the hot water pound against my shoulders until the small bathroom filled with steam. And when I came out wrapped in a towel, Tyler was sitting on the bed holding my phone, and the expression on his face made my blood turn to ice. "Who is Michael?" he asked, and his voice was too quiet, too controlled. And I realized with sickening clarity that he had gone through my contacts while I was in the shower, had seen Vincent's number that I had saved under a fake name, because some part of me knew even then that I might need him. "Just a customer from the diner," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to project the exhaustion and resignation that usually made Tyler back down. But something was different tonight. Something in him had shifted past the point where my surrender would satisfy. "You are lying," he said, standing up, and the phone looked small in his hand, fragile. "Why would a customer give you his personal number? Why would you save it?" I tried to explain, said some people left numbers for carry-out orders, that it did not mean anything, but he was not listening anymore. His face flushing red the way it always did before the violence came. He spat, and the word hit like a fist before his actual hand did, cracking across my face hard enough that I tasted copper. Felt my lips split open again in almost the same place as the half-healed cut from 2 nights ago. He started crying immediately, the rage collapsing into sobbing apologies, reaching for me, but I was already moving, grabbing my phone from where he had dropped it, backing toward the bedroom. And when he lunged after me, I slammed the door and locked it with shaking hands. I heard him collapse against the wall outside, heard him crying and pleading, and I sat on the floor with my back against the door and my split lip bleeding onto my shirt and pulled up Vincent's number. And at 2 a.m., when the apartment finally went silent and I could hear Tyler snoring on the couch, I typed one word and hit send. The response came in 30 seconds. Just one word glowing on my cracked phone screen in the darkness of the locked bedroom. Address. My hands shook so badly I could barely type out the street name and apartment number. Each letter a commitment I could not take back. And the moment I hit send, his reply came through with the same terrifying efficiency. 20 minutes. Do not engage. Stay in locked room. I stared at those words and felt something shift inside me. Some final tether to my old life snapping clean. Because I was really doing this, really letting a man I had met once, a dangerous man whose world operated in shadows and violence, come to my apartment in the middle of the night to handle my problems in ways I could not let myself imagine too clearly. I moved on autopilot after that, pulling my battered duffel bag from the closet and stuffing clothes into it without caring what I grabbed. Vincent arrived exactly 20 minutes later, his knock soft but purposeful, and I opened the door with shaking hands to find him standing there in dark clothes that made him blend with the shadows, his gray eyes taking in my swollen face and split lip with an expression that made the air between us go dangerous and electric. Behind him stood another man, tall and broad with dark hair and the same controlled stillness that marked them both as predators, and Vincent introduced him quietly as Dante, his associate who was there to help. Vincent asked if Tyler was inside, and I nodded, told him Tyler was passed out drunk on the couch, probably would not wake up for hours, and Vincent exchanged a look with Dante that spoke a language I was only beginning to understand. Vincent told me to wait in the hallway, to stay back no matter what I heard, and something in his voice made it clear this was not a request. I pressed myself against the wall and watched them disappear into my apartment, watched the door close behind them with a soft click that somehow sounded final. I heard voices, low and controlled, Tyler's voice climbing high with panic and confusion, words I could not make out through the thin walls. And then silence. Heavy, absolute silence that stretched for minutes and felt like hours. When Vincent emerged, he was alone, and his clothes were still unmarked, his expression calm in a way that should have terrified me, but instead filled me with relief, so powerful my knees almost gave out. Dante appeared moments later carrying my duffel bag like it weighed nothing, and Vincent took my arm gently, carefully, guiding me away from the apartment and down the stairs toward the street, where a black SUV waited like some sleek predator. Vincent opened the back door and helped me inside, his hand warm and steady at my elbow, and I did not ask what happened to Tyler. Did not want to know. Some questions were better left unanswered. And then softer ever, and the certainty in his voice should have terrified me. This confirmation that he would do something irreversible and possibly unforgivable to Tyler. But instead, I felt a wave of relief so powerful, my knees almost buckled because someone was finally going to make it stop. Dante turned out to be a man of few words, which I appreciated because I had none left in me, and he guided me down the narrow apartment stairs with a hand hovering near my elbow, never quite touching, but ready to steady me if I stumbled. And when we emerged onto the street, the black SUV waited like some sleek predator, windows tinted so dark I could not see inside, and he opened the back door and helped me in with surprising gentleness, for someone built like he could break a person in half without effort. The interior smelled like leather and something expensive I could not name, and Dante handed me a bottle of water and a small package of tissues without comment. Just a brief nod before he closed the door and took position outside the vehicle, standing with his back to me, scanning the empty street like threats might materialize from the shadows between the flickering street lights. I sat in the silence and darkness and tried not to imagine what was happening 3 floors above me. Tried not to picture Vincent and Tyler in that cramped living room with its stained carpet and broken blinds, but my mind conjured images anyway, violence playing out in flashes behind my eyes. And I pressed the cold water bottle against my split lip and told myself I did not care what happened to Tyler, that he had made his choices and now faced the consequences. But guilt still twisted in my stomach because some part of me had been trained to feel responsible for male anger, trained to believe I caused the violence I received. I heard it then, voices raised and harsh filtering down through the building's thin walls. Tyler's voice high and panicked. Another voice too low and controlled to make out words. And then silence, heavy and absolute. The kind of silence that meant something had shifted, something had ended. My hand started shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the water bottle. And I watched the building in trance with my heart hammering against my ribs, counting seconds that stretched into hours. And then Vincent emerged, just walking out the front door like he had simply paid a social call, his clothes unmarked, his stride unhurried, and even from a distance I could see his face was composed, almost serene, no evidence of whatever had transpired upstairs except for something dark and satisfied in his eyes. When Dante opened the door and Vincent slid into the back seat beside me, the driver, a silent figure I had not even registered before, started the engine without being told. And Vincent looked at me with those gray eyes that saw too much. And he said simply, "Go." And we pulled away from the curb, away from that building that had been my prison. And I finally found my voice and asked, "What did you do?" Needing to know, needing to understand what line he had crossed for me. Vincent was quiet for a moment, his jaw tight, and then he said, "Tyler received a clear message and a financial incentive to leave the city permanently. He will not bother you again." And his voice held such certainty, such absolute finality that I knew whatever had happened in that apartment had been thorough and terrifying, and probably involved threats I could not let myself imagine in detail. I should have felt guilty, should have felt afraid, should have questioned what kind of man solved problems with intimidation and violence. But instead, I felt something else entirely. A lightness spreading through my chest like I had been holding my breath for 2 years and could finally exhale. Liberation so profound it made me dizzy. Vincent asked, "Where do you want to go?" And the question was simple. But the answer was impossible because I had nowhere. No family who would take me in after I had ignored their warnings about Tyler. No friends left after he had systematically isolated me from everyone who cared. No money for a hotel or apartment deposit. Nothing except the clothes in my duffel bag and the bruises on my skin. I admitted I have nowhere, and the words tasted like failure. And Vincent studied me in the dim light filtering through the tinted windows, the city sliding past outside. And he said, "I have a guest house on my property, separate space, fully secure. You can stay there just until you stabilize, figure out your next steps." And I understood what he was really offering. Understood that accepting meant stepping fully into his world, the world of a man who could make other men disappear with a conversation and a financial incentive. But I also understood I was choosing this, choosing him, choosing whatever safety his dangerous protection could provide. And I said yes before I could second-guess myself. I accept, and watched something shift in his expression, satisfaction and possession, and something almost tender, and he nodded once and told the driver an address I did not recognize, and we drove through the city toward whatever came next. Guest house turned out to be bigger than the entire apartment I had shared with Tyler, bigger and more beautiful than anywhere I had ever lived in my 26 years. And when Vincent unlocked the front door and gestured me inside, I felt like I had stepped into some alternate universe where people actually lived like this, with gleaming hardwood floors and soft rugs that probably cost more than my car, with furniture that looked like it belonged in magazines, with windows that stretched floor to ceiling and showed a manicured lawn disappearing into darkness. Vincent moved through the space with easy familiarity, turning on lights, adjusting the thermostat, explaining things in that low, controlled voice that made me feel simultaneously safe and hyper-aware of his presence. And he showed me the security system with its sleek touchpad by the door, walking me through the code twice to make sure I had it memorized, telling me the system connected directly to his phone and to a private security company that would respond in under 3 minutes if I triggered the alarm. His main house was 100 yards away across the lawn. He explained, close enough if I needed him, but far enough to give me privacy, space to breathe and heal. And he would not intrude on that space unless I asked him to. And something about the way he said it made my chest tight, because when had anyone ever cared about my space, my needs, my boundaries? The kitchen was fully stocked, he continued, opening cabinets to show me dishes and glasses, opening the refrigerator to reveal more food than I typically had access to in a month. And his housekeeper, Mrs. Chun, would check on me tomorrow, bring anything I needed, and she was trustworthy and kind, and I should not hesitate to ask her for anything at all. I stood in the middle of this beautiful space with my pathetic duffel bag at my feet, and my split lip throbbing and my cheeks swelling, and I finally asked the question that had been building since he pulled up to my apartment building like some dangerous avenging angel. Asked, "Why are you doing this?" And he asked if I was afraid of him, direct and unflinching. And I considered lying, considered saying no, but I had enough of lies and said yes, but not the way I was afraid of Tyler. And I saw understanding flash in his eyes. Vincent appreciated my honesty in a way I could see in the slight relaxation of his shoulders, the softening around his eyes, and he moved further into the guest house, keeping a careful distance like he understood I needed space, even as we talked about danger and protection and the reality of what his life actually was. He explained in that measured, deliberate voice that he ran security and logistics businesses, some legal and some less so. And he would not insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise, would not dress up his empire in polite euphemisms, when the truth was he controlled significant portions of the city through methods that existed in gray areas and sometimes darker places than that. If I stayed here, even temporarily, people in his world and outside it would assume I was under his protection, and that designation would keep me safer than any restraining order or police intervention ever could. But it would also associate me with him, tie my name to his reputation, mark me as belonging to Vincent Marcelli in ways that could not be easily undone. She could leave any time, he continued, his gray eyes holding mine with absolute sincerity. And he would set me up with an apartment in a different part of the city, give me enough money to start over properly, create a fresh start somewhere far from both Tyler and from him, and there would be no judgment in that choice, no resentment, just his genuine wish for my safety and happiness, whatever form that took. I found myself asking, what happens if I stay? The question coming out quieter than I intended, and I watched something shift in Vincent's expression, his eyes darkening to smoke and steel, intensity radiating from him in waves that made my skin prickle with awareness. They would navigate that together, he said, his voice dropping lower, and the words felt like a promise and a warning and an invitation all at once. Felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and being asked if I wanted to jump. I felt a pull toward him. I did not understand, could not explain. This dangerous, beautiful man who had shown me more respect and genuine care in the past 24 hours than Tyler had managed in 2 years, who looked at my bruises with fury on my behalf rather than shame at what I had allowed, who offered me safety and choice and honesty when I had been living in lies and fear for so long. I told him I wanted to stay, at least until I figured out my next steps, at least until I could think clearly and plan properly, and become someone who could stand on her own. And Vincent nodded slowly, something flickering in his eyes that might have been satisfaction or relief or want. I woke the next morning in a bed softer than any I had ever slept in, sunlight streaming through windows that faced a garden instead of a brick wall, and for the first few seconds, I forgot where I was, forgot how I had gotten there. Then memory crashed back, and I sat up too quickly, heart racing, before the silence registered. Real silence. No Tyler stumbling around the kitchen, no television blaring, no raised voices or slamming doors. Just quiet broken only by birds outside and my own breathing. I found a breakfast tray outside the door when I finally worked up the courage to open it, covered with cloth that kept everything warm. Fruit and pastries and coffee that smelled like heaven, and a note written in elegant handwriting. Elena, I hope you slept well. I will check on you this afternoon, Mrs. Chun. I carried the tray inside and ate slowly, tasting food for the first time in what felt like years instead of just consuming fuel to survive. And then I forced myself into the shower, let hot water pound against muscles that act from tension I could finally release. The mirror showed me damage I had been avoiding. My split lip healing, but still swollen. My cheek bruised, deep purple spreading toward my eye. Finger-shaped marks on both arms and layers of yellow and green and fresh blue, ribs tender when I pressed them, and I stood there cataloging it all like evidence, proof of what I had endured and what I had finally escaped. I dressed in the softest clothes from my duffel bag, leggings, and an oversized sweater that felt like armor against the world. And I explored the guest house properly in daylight, finding a library filled with books that looked read rather than decorative, art on the walls that seemed chosen for beauty rather than investment, comfortable spaces that invited rest. And I felt something in my chest loosen because this was not a showplace. This was a home. Through the window, I saw Vincent's main house across the lawn, larger and more imposing, and movement caught my eye. Vincent himself visible through a window. On his phone, pacing with that controlled intensity, I recognized, looking severe and powerful in ways that should have frightened me. And as I watched, he glanced toward the guest house like he knew I was there. And our eyes met across the distance, held for a moment that stretched and pulled tight. He ended his call abruptly, said something I could not hear, and then he was walking across the lawn toward me with purpose in every stride. And my heart started hammering because I did not know what this was, what we were, what happened now. He knocked on the door, and I let him in, and he asked, "How did you sleep?" His gray eyes searching my face, taking in the bruises with an expression that made my breath catch. And I admitted better than I have slept in years, which was true. I had not woken once in terror or frozen in fear, listening for footsteps. I watched him catalog my appearance the way I was cataloging his, the tailored shirt that fit him perfectly, the expensive watch, the controlled power he wore as easily as his clothes. And he asked if I was afraid of him, direct and unflinching. And I considered lying, considered saying no, but I had enough of lies and said yes, but not the way I was afraid of Tyler. And I saw understanding flash in his eyes. Vincent appreciated my honesty in a way I could see in the slight relaxation of his shoulders, the softening around his eyes, and he moved further into the guest house, keeping a careful distance like he understood I needed space, even as we talked about danger and protection and the reality of what his life actually was. But Mrs. Chin gave me a knowing look that made heat crawl up my neck and said, "Whatever you say, dear," with an expression that suggested she saw right through my protest to the truth I was not ready to acknowledge. On day 4, Vincent invited me to dinner at the main house, and I changed clothes 3 times, nervous like I was going on a first date, instead of crossing a lawn to eat with the man who had rescued me from hell. Finally settling on a simple dark blue dress from the new clothes that made me feel pretty without trying too hard. The dining room was intimate rather than imposing, candle lit and warm, and Vincent stood when I entered, his gray eyes tracking over me with an appreciation that made my breath catch, and he pulled out my chair like I was someone worth this kind of careful courtesy. He poured wine, rich and red, and asked about my life before Tyler, before the bruises and fear, and I found myself talking haltingly about dreams I had abandoned, the business degree I left unfinished when money ran out, the family who stopped speaking to me when I would not leave Tyler the first time they noticed something was wrong, the person I used to be before I learned to make myself small and quiet and invisible. Vincent listened with complete attention, the kind of focus that made me feel like nothing else in the world existed except my words and the space between us. And for the first time in years, I felt truly seen. Dinner became a regular occurrence, a ritual that anchored my days in ways I had not expected. And over the following week, we met each evening in that candle-lit dining room where the outside world seemed to fade into insignificance. And all that existed was the space between us and the words we offered like fragile gifts. Vincent revealed pieces of himself in measured increments. His rise in the organization after his mother's death, when he was still just a boy with rage and grief and nowhere to put either, except into survival and eventually into power, climbing ranks through intelligence and ruthlessness, but also through a code he developed early and never violated. Rules about never harming women or children, about keeping drugs out of schools, about protecting the people in his territory even as he controlled them. He spoke of enemies with cold assessment, rivals who respected boundaries and those who did not, allies who were trustworthy until they were not, the constant chess game of his world where one wrong move could cost everything. I shared things I had never told anyone. The shame that lived in my chest about staying with Tyler so long, about making excuses and believing promises and returning again and again to someone who hurt me, the crushing weight of feeling stupid and weak and complicit in my own suffering. Vincent stopped me mid-sentence, his hand covering mine on the table, and said, "Survivors do what they must to survive. There is no shame in that, only strength in the fact that I was still here, still breathing, still capable of sitting across from him and speaking truth." Our conversations deepened with each passing night, moving from facts and history into philosophy and dreams, and I caught him watching me sometimes with heat in his eyes that made my skin flush and my breath catch. An intensity that was different from his usual controlled focus, something raw and hungry that called to an answering need I was only beginning to acknowledge in myself. One night, reaching for my wine glass at the same moment he reached for his, our hands touched, and the contact was electric, a jolt that traveled from my fingertips straight to my core, and neither of us pulled away. Vincent's thumb stroked along my wrist, gentle and deliberate over the faded bruises that were now yellow and green, healing marks that no longer hurt except in memory. And he asked in a voice rough with restraint if he could touch my face. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and his hand came up to cut my cheek, warm and calloused and impossibly tender, and I leaned into his touch like a plant turning towards sunlight. He murmured that I was beautiful, and the way he said it made me believe him, made me feel beautiful in a way I had not felt in years, maybe ever, because Tyler's compliments had always come with conditions and criticisms attached. But Vincent's words felt like simple truth offered without expectation of anything in return. The moment shattered like dropped crystal when Vincent's phone buzzed against the table, harsh and insistent in the soft candle-lit space we had created, and his expression shifted from tender to severe in a heartbeat. The business mask sliding into place with practiced ease as he glanced at the screen, and his jaw tightened in a way that told me this was not something he could ignore. He apologized, voice rough with reluctance and what might have been frustration, said he had to handle this immediately. It could not wait, and told me to stay, finish the wine, make myself comfortable in his study if I wanted. He would return as soon as possible. I nodded, tried to hide my disappointment, watched him stride from the room with that focused intensity that transformed him from the man who touched me, like I was precious, into something harder and more dangerous, the duality of him both fascinating and unsettling. I moved to his study because sitting alone in the dining room felt too exposed, too vulnerable, and the study was all dark wood and leather, and the scent of him, books lining the walls, and a massive desk positioned to face the windows overlooking the grounds. I saw the photos on his desk almost immediately, drawn to them like they held answers to questions I had not yet learned to ask. Young Vincent, maybe 10 or 11, with a beautiful woman who had his eyes in his bone structure, her smile radiant and her hand on his shoulder in a gesture of such casual affection that my heart ached looking at it, knowing what Vincent had told me about how she died. I heard raised voices outside, sharp and angry, cutting through the quiet night, and I moved to the window instinctively, looking out to see Vincent in the courtyard with a tall blonde man I had never seen before, their body language aggressive. The stranger gesturing wildly, while Vincent stood utterly still in that way that meant he was most dangerous. The man pointed toward the guest house, toward where I had been staying, toward me essentially. And even from this distance, I could see the accusation in the gesture, the challenge. Vincent stepped into the man's space, close enough that it was clearly a threat, his posture radiating violence, held on the thinnest leash, and the blond man backed down immediately, hands raised in placation or surrender before he turned and walked quickly toward the front gates. Vincent stood there for a long moment after the man left, head bowed, hands clenched at his sides, before he turned and walked back toward the house with measured steps that spoke of iron control. He found me standing at the window when he entered the study. Must have known I had seen everything, and his expression was unreadable when he asked if I was all right. I asked if I was causing him problems, if my presence here was creating complications he did not need, already knowing the answer, but needing to hear him say it. He said nothing he could not handle, dismissive in a way that did not invite further questions. But I pressed anyway, asked who the man was. Vincent hesitated, a pause that felt weighted with calculation about what to tell me and what to withhold before he said that was Marcus Stone, his second in command, and he had concerns about outsiders, about security, about variables he could not control. I understood immediately that I was the variable, the outsider, the complication, and I offered to leave, to remove myself from the equation. Even though the thought made something in my chest twist painfully, Vincent closed the distance between us in 3 long strides, crowding into my space, and said with absolute finality that I stayed. Tension stretched between us like a wire pulled taut, vibrating with potential energy and unspoken want. And I could feel the heat radiating from Vincent's body, where he stood so close that the space between us felt charged and dangerous in an entirely different way than the danger I had learned to recognize from his world. He asked in a voice low and rough if I understood what it meant to be under his protection, what it truly meant beyond the security and the guest house and the safety from Tyler. And I said I was beginning to understand that I saw how his men looked at me now, how Marcus had come to assess whether I was worth the complication, how being associated with Vincent meant being marked as his in a way that both sheltered and exposed me. He asked if that frightened me, if he frightened me, and I admitted that everything about him should terrify me. This man who commanded criminal empires and inspired fear and dangerous men and had erased Tyler from my life with a few quiet words and probably violence I would never know the details of. But instead of fear, I felt safe for the first time in years. Felt like I could breathe fully without waiting for the next blow. Something shifted in Vincent's expression when I said that. The iron control he maintained so carefully slipping just enough that I could see the raw need beneath it. The one he had been restraining out of respect for my healing and my trauma and the power imbalance between us. He stepped closer, closing the last inches of distance, and framed my face with both hands, his palms warm and slightly rough against my cheeks, his thumbs stroking gently along my cheekbones, as he asked in a voice that shook slightly if he could kiss me. I whispered yes, barely able to force the word past the tightness in my throat and the hammering of my heart. And then his mouth was on mine, and it was nothing like kissing Tyler. Nothing like the demanding, possessive way Tyler had taken affection, like it was owed to him. Mrs. Chun found me humming while making coffee in the guest house kitchen, and she gave me a knowing look, her eyes twinkling with barely suppressed amusement as she said, I had a certain glow about me this morning, and she was happy to see it. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but could not stop smiling. And she patted my hand in that maternal way she had and said, Vincent deserved happiness, and perhaps I did, too. I spent the morning helping Mrs. Chun with household tasks, needing purpose and activity to channel the restless energy humming through me. And she talked while we worked, sharing stories about Vincent, how she had come to work for him 15 years ago when he was just 19 and newly in charge of the family business, how fierce and brilliant and lonely he had been, how she had watched him build an empire but never let anyone truly close. In the afternoon, I was reading in the guest house when a knock at the door made me tense, instinctive weariness flooding through me because Vincent was gone, and I did not expect anyone. And when I looked through the peephole, I saw Marcus Stone standing on the doorstep, looking polite but serious. I opened the door slowly, keeping it partially closed, and he smiled, but it did not reach his eyes as he asked if he could have a few minutes of my time. He was polite, carefully so, but cold in a way that made clear this was not a social visit. And once inside, he got straight to the point, said he needed to understand my intentions with Vincent. I bristled immediately, said that was between Vincent and me, none of his concern. But Marcus shook his head and explained that everything involving Vincent was his concern because his job was keeping Vincent safe, and I was an unknown variable. He warned me that Vincent had enemies, serious, dangerous people who would not hesitate to use me to hurt him, that I was a liability whether I intended to be or not, and his eyes were hard when he said I needed to understand what staying meant. I stood firm despite my racing heart, lifted my chin, and said, I never asked for any of this, but I was done running from fear, done making myself small to avoid danger, and if staying with Vincent meant risk, then that was my choice to make. Marcus studied me for a long moment, reassessing, and something shifted in his expression before he nodded slowly and said, maybe I was stronger than I looked. Maybe I would survive this world after all. He left without another word, but I stood shaking after the door closed, adrenaline flooding through me as I realized I had just been tested and apparently passed. But the encounter left me unsettled and frighteningly aware of how much I still did not understand about the life I was choosing. I told Vincent about Marcus's visit that night over dinner, my hands wrapped around a wine glass for something to hold. As I recounted the conversation, and I watched Vincent's expression darken with each detail until fury sparked in his gray eyes, and his jaw tightened with barely contained anger. He said Marcus overstepped, that he had no right to interrogate me or make me feel threatened in what was supposed to be my safe space. And I could see him calculating consequences and responses even as he spoke. I reached across the table and touched his hand, stilling the tension coiled in his fingers, and said that Marcus was protecting him, doing what he thought necessary to keep Vincent safe. And maybe I needed to understand that kind of loyalty, even if it made me uncomfortable. Vincent turned his hand over to grip mine, said that was not Marcus's call to make, that I was not a security threat to be assessed and managed, but someone under his protection, and increasingly more than that. I said I understood this world had rules I did not know, codes and hierarchies and protocols that everyone else seemed to grasp instinctively. And if I was going to stay, then I needed to learn them, needed to understand how to navigate the structure around him. Vincent studied me across the candlelight, his expression shifting from anger to something more searching and vulnerable, and asked if I truly wanted into his life, if I understood what that meant beyond the surface attraction and the safety he provided. I met his eyes steadily and said I wanted him, that the rest came with that choice, and I was making it with open eyes. He warned me it meant danger, that his enemies would see me as leverage and target, that it meant secrecy, because much of what he did could never be spoken about openly, that it meant moral compromise because his world operated in shades of gray, where right and wrong blurred into expedience and survival. I said I went from one cage with Tyler to another kind of prison in the isolation and fear I had lived with. But this choice felt different because I was choosing it freely, choosing him and the life he offered with full knowledge of what it contained. Something flashed in his eyes, heat and possession and need all tangled together, and he stood abruptly and came around the table to pull me to my feet and then into his arms. He listened, actually listened with the full weight of his attention, asked questions about my reasoning, incorporated my thoughts into his planning, and I realized with sudden clarity that I could have purpose here, that I did not have to be just the woman under his protection, but could be a partner in building something. Morning came too quickly, pale light filtering through the curtains, and Vincent kissed my forehead and said he had meetings with his organization leaders, important conversations about territory and alliances that could not be postponed. And then he surprised me by saying he wanted me to come with him, that it was time his inner circle met the woman who had become central to his life. My stomach fluttered with nerves as I dressed in clothes that felt too casual for meeting mob bosses. But Vincent assured me I was perfect, that I did not need to perform or impress anyone, that my presence itself made the statement he needed to make. We drove to a restaurant closed for private business, the kind of establishment that looked modest from outside, but inside was elegant and clearly secured, and in a back room sat 5 men who stood when we entered, their eyes immediately assessing me with the sharp attention of people whose survival depended on reading threats. Vincent introduced them by name and role. Marcus Stone, whom I had already met, Dante Rossi, who had helped rescue me from Tyler, and 3 others whose names and territories I tried to memorize, and they shook my hand with varying degrees of warmth, but universal weariness. Vincent did not sit, instead stood with his hand on my lower back, and made clear and concise words that I was not temporary, not a fling he would tire of, but someone under his full protection, who had become integral to his life, and anyone who threatened me answered to him personally. The temperature in the room shifted, something settling as the men exchanged glances and then nodded their acceptance. And I understood with crystal certainty that I had just crossed a threshold, that there was no going back to the woman who delivered pizzas and dreamed of escape, because I had entered Vincent's world permanently and irrevocably. Weeks passed in a blur of integration and transformation as I found myself woven into the fabric of Vincent's life in ways that felt both natural and surreal. And he gave me real work managing the legitimate sides of his business empire, the security consulting firm, and the real estate holdings that operated in full daylight with proper contracts and legal structures. I proved myself capable quickly, my abandoned business degree finally finding purpose as I streamlined operations and identified expansion opportunities. And I watched the men who had assessed me with such weariness begin to nod when I spoke in meetings to ask my opinion on deals to treat me as more than just the boss's woman. Vincent and I grew closer with each passing day, the intensity between us deepening into something profound and unshakable. And he told me he loved me one night after a charity gala where I had worn emerald silk and stood beside him as he worked with politicians and businessmen who pretended not to know the source of his wealth. I said it back without hesitation because I meant it with every fiber of my being, and I saw the way his eyes softened with something like relief, as though he had feared I might not feel the same depth of emotion. But danger came, as it inevitably does in his world, swift and brutal, and targeting the weakness everyone could see. I was taken from a parking garage 3 blocks from Vincent's office building, grabbed from behind as I walked to my car, a cloth over my mouth that smelled chemical and wrong, and I woke in a warehouse with my head pounding and my wrists zip-tied to a metal chair. My captor stepped into view and my blood turned to ice because it was Tyler alive and smirking and clearly working with people who wanted to hurt Vincent through me. He said he had sold information about me to a rival organization, details about my routines and vulnerabilities, and they had paid him well, while also offering him the revenge he craved after Vincent had driven him from the city. Fear spiked through me sharp and familiar. The old terror of being at Tyler's mercy. But it was tangled now with fury because I had fought so hard to escape him and build something new. Tyler gloated about how Vincent would have to trade territory and concessions to get me back, how this would the main empire, and I laughed bitterly, despite my split lip, because he had no idea what he had started. I told him Vincent did not negotiate with people who took what was his, that Tyler had just signed his own death warrant, and I watched uncertainty flicker across his face before rage replaced it. He hit me hard across the face, and I tasted blood again, that familiar copper tang, but I did not break or beg because I was not the same woman he had terrorized, and I knew with absolute certainty that Vincent was already coming for me. Gunfire erupted outside the warehouse in sharp staccato bursts that made Tyler's head snap toward the sound, his bravado crumbling into panic as he realized Vincent had not come to negotiate, but to wage war. The aftermath settled over us like dust after an explosion. And in the days and weeks that followed Tyler's death and the dismantling of the rival organization that had thought they could use me as leverage against Vincent, I found myself recovering both physically and emotionally in ways I had not thought possible. Vincent never left my side during the healing process, canceling meetings and delegating responsibilities so he could be present as I worked through nightmares and sudden panic attacks triggered by unexpected sounds or movements. And his steady presence became my anchor in a way that made me understand the difference between dependence born of fear and partnership built on choice. I came to understand the full scope of his world during those months, the violence and moral complexity that existed beneath the surface of legitimate business operations. And I accepted it with clear eyes because I was not a naive victim anymore, but rather a partner to a dangerous man who had shown me more respect and care than anyone in my previous life ever had. I helped expand the legitimate operations with genuine enthusiasm, applying my business knowledge to real estate acquisitions and security consulting contracts, while understanding that the shadows underneath funded and protected everything we built in the light. Vincent proposed 3 months after the kidnapping on an ordinary Tuesday evening, as we sat on the terrace, watching the city lights spread below us like scattered diamonds. And the ring he offered was simple and perfect, a single emerald flanked by diamonds that caught the light like captured fire. He asked me to marry him and share his life completely, all of it, the empire and the danger and the future we would build together. And I said yes without hesitation because I had already chosen this path the moment I texted him for help from my locked bedroom. We married quietly with just the inner circle present in the garden behind his house. Mrs. Chun crying happy tears as she watched me walk toward Vincent in a dress of ivory silk that made me feel like someone entirely new. And Marcus stood as best man and toasted to me afterward, admitting in front of everyone that he had been wrong about me, that I belonged here in ways he had not anticipated, and I saw genuine respect in his eyes. On our wedding night, Vincent held me close in the darkness of our bedroom and told me that I had saved him as much as he had saved me, that I had given him something beyond the empire he had built from blood and necessity, a reason to imagine a future that included more than territory and power. I responded that I had found myself in his protection, discovered strength I had not known I possessed, and together we had built something real and lasting from the broken pieces we had both carried. Neither of us was perfect, and our life together would never be simple or safe. But we were perfect together in our imperfection. Two damaged people who had recognized something essential in each other that first night, when a pizza delivery to the wrong address had changed both our lives forever, and the future stretched before us dangerous and uncertain, but utterly ours to claim and defend and shape into whatever we chose to make it. 2 years into our marriage, I discovered I was pregnant on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Vincent had left early for a meeting with his accountants, legitimate business that required his attention to the complex web of holdings we had built together. I had been feeling strange for weeks, tired in ways that sleep could not fix, nauseous at the smell of coffee that had never bothered me before, emotional in ways that felt foreign and overwhelming. The pregnancy test sat on the bathroom counter like a small bomb, 2 pink lines that changed everything in an instant. I stared at it for a long time, joy and terror warring in my chest, because I wanted this baby with Vincent more than I had ever wanted anything. But I also understood what this meant in his world. A child made us vulnerable in ways we had never been before, gave our enemies a target more precious than either of our lives. Vincent found me sitting on the edge of our bed holding the test when he returned from his meeting, and I watched his face cycle through surprise, wonder, fierce protectiveness, and something that looked like fear before settling into the controlled mask he wore when calculating threats and responses. He sat beside me without speaking, took the test from my hands, and studied it like he was memorizing evidence, and I could see him already planning, already building walls around this new reality. He asked how I felt, and I admitted I was terrified and excited in equal measure, that I wanted this baby, but knew what it meant for our safety, for the careful balance we had created. Vincent pulled me into his arms and said we would handle it, that we would protect this child the way we had learned to protect each other, and his voice held absolute certainty even though I could feel the tension in his body as he held me. The pregnancy became a strategic operation as much as a biological process. Vincent tripled security around the property, added cameras and motion sensors, and guards who moved through our lives like shadows. He brought in a private doctor, someone he trusted completely, who came to the house for every appointment rather than risking public medical facilities. Mrs. Chun fussed over me with maternal intensity, preparing special foods and insisting I rest more than felt natural for someone who had spent years in constant motion. Marcus, who had become genuinely protective of me over the months, approached the pregnancy like a military campaign, analyzing threats and vulnerabilities with the same focus he brought to territorial disputes. But Vincent also revealed a tenderness I had never seen before, a gentle wonder that emerged in quiet moments when he thought no one was watching. He talked to my growing belly in the evenings, his hands spread across my skin as he told our unborn child about the world we were building, the empire we would leave behind, the legitimate businesses that would provide security without requiring moral compromise. He read pregnancy books with the same intensity he brought to business contracts, asked Dr. Martinez detailed questions about nutrition and development and risks, prepared for fatherhood with characteristic thoroughness. The threats came sooner than we expected, subtle at first, then increasingly direct. A rival family, the Santoros, who had been testing our boundaries for months, began making inquiries about my condition, my routines, my vulnerabilities. Vincent's contacts in the police department reported conversations they should not have been having, plans being made in restaurants and social clubs where our enemies thought they were safe from surveillance. I felt like prey again, hunted in ways that reminded me of the helplessness I had felt with Tyler, except now the stakes were impossibly higher because it was not just my life in danger. Vincent convened his inner circle on a Tuesday evening when I was 6 months pregnant, my belly round and obvious beneath the flowing dresses I wore to business meetings. The dining room that had become our sanctuary was transformed into a war room, maps and photographs spread across the table where we usually shared wine and conversation. Marcus laid out the intelligence they had gathered, the pattern of surveillance and preparation that suggested the Santoros were planning something significant. They had identified the doctor's schedule, the routes I took to my few approved destinations, the timing of Vincent's meetings that took him away from the property. Dante, whose loyalty had never wavered since that first night he helped rescue me from Tyler, suggested moving me to a safe house outside the city, somewhere completely removed from Vincent's known properties. But Vincent rejected that immediately, said separation made us both more vulnerable, that our strength had always come from partnership rather than isolation. I surprised myself by speaking up, by pointing out weaknesses in their defensive plans that they had not considered, suggesting modifications to routines that would make surveillance more difficult without completely disrupting the business operations that funded our security. Marcus looked at me with something approaching respect as I outlined my thoughts, and Vincent smiled with pride and possession and something deeper that made my chest tight with emotion. We were partners in this, truly partners, not protector and protected, but equals facing a threat that required both of our strengths. The meeting lasted until after midnight, plans refined and contingencies prepared, and when the men finally left, Vincent and I sat in the quiet dining room with my hand on my belly and his arm around my shoulders, feeling our baby move between us like a promise of the future we were fighting to protect. The attack came 3 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon when Vincent was supposed to be meeting with city planning officials about a construction project. But the meeting had been moved, a last-minute change that probably saved our lives, and he was in his study when the first shots shattered the afternoon quiet. I was in the garden reading, enjoying the September sunshine, when Dante appeared beside me moving with urgent purpose and told me we needed to go inside immediately. The baby kicked hard as adrenaline flooded my system, and I pressed my hand against my belly instinctively, protectively, as Dante guided me toward the house with one hand on my elbow and the other on his weapon. Vincent met us at the door, his face set in lines of cold fury that made him look dangerous in ways I had not seen since that first night when he dealt with Tyler. He had a pistol in his hand and determination in his eyes that brooked no argument as he explained quickly that armed men had breached the outer perimeter, that this was what they had been preparing for, and I needed to go to the safe room we had constructed in the basement while he and his men handled the threat. I started to protest, to say I wanted to stay with him, but another burst of gunfire cut through my words, and Vincent kissed me hard and fast before pushing me toward the stairs that led down to safety. The safe room was lined with steel and soundproofing, equipped with communications equipment and enough supplies to last for days if necessary. I sat in the artificial quiet with my hands on my belly, feeling our baby respond to my elevated heart rate, trying not to imagine what was happening above me. The minutes crawled by like hours, punctuated occasionally by muffled sounds that might have been gunfire or doors slamming or furniture being overturned. I found myself talking to the baby, promising that Daddy would keep us safe, that this would be over soon, that we would have a normal life somehow despite the violence that surrounded us. When the all-clear finally came, When Vincent's voice crackled through the intercom telling me it was safe to come up, I climbed the stairs on shaking legs to find the house transformed. Broken glass and splintered wood marked where bullets had found their targets. But the damage was contained, controlled, evidence of a threat neutralized rather than a home destroyed. Vincent was waiting for me in the living room, unmarked but grim, and he pulled me into his arms with relief and possession and apologies for exposing me to this danger. Marcus appeared in the doorway with Dante behind him, both men looking satisfied in a way that suggested the threat had been eliminated permanently. The Santoros had overplayed their hand, Marcus reported, had sent too few men with inadequate intelligence, and now they were dealing with consequences that would echo through their organization for years to come. I did not ask for details about what those consequences entailed, did not want to know the specifics of how Vincent's world dealt with people who threatened pregnant women and unborn children. That night, as we lay in our bed with Vincent's hand on my belly and the house quiet around us, he apologized again for the danger, for the life we had chosen that put our child at risk before they were even born. I stopped him mid-sentence, placed my hand over his, and said this was our life, our choice, our family, and we would protect it together no matter what threats emerged from the shadows. Our baby kicked against our joined hands as if agreeing, as if already understanding that they were being born into a world where love and violence existed in complicated proximity. Dr. Martinez increased the frequency of his visits after the attack, monitoring my blood pressure and stress levels with the intensity of someone who understood the unique challenges of my situation. Mrs. Chen barely left my side, fussing over my nutrition and rest with maternal protectiveness that both comforted and overwhelmed me. Vincent canceled all non-essential meetings, worked from home whenever possible, and when business required his physical presence elsewhere, he left me surrounded by enough security to protect a head of state. The baby was born on a snowy February morning, 3 weeks before her due date, labor starting suddenly and progressing quickly enough that Dr. Martinez barely arrived in time. Vincent held my hand through every contraction, coached me through breathing and pushing with the same focused intensity he brought to everything that mattered to him. When our daughter finally emerged, slippery and screaming and perfect, Vincent cried openly for the first time since I had known him, tears streaming down his face as Dr. Martinez placed our child in his arms. We named her Sophia, after Vincent's mother, and she was beautiful in the way that new babies are beautiful, red-faced and wrinkled and absolutely perfect. Vincent held her like she was made of spun glass. This dangerous man who commanded empires rendered speechless by 8 pounds of infant humanity. I watched him study her tiny features, her miniature hands and delicate eyelashes, and I could see him falling in love all over again, this time with someone who would own his heart completely and unconditionally. The first months of Sophia's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming love and the strange adjustment of being parents in a world where normal family life required armed guards and bulletproof glass. Vincent proved to be a devoted father, changing diapers with the same meticulous attention he gave to contract negotiations, walking the floors at 2 in the morning when Sophia had colic, researching child development with characteristic thoroughness. Mrs. Chun helped with everything, teaching me techniques her own grandmother had used, providing the maternal wisdom I lacked from my own fractured family history. But even in those tender early days, we could not escape the reality of Vincent's world entirely. Security measures that had felt excessive during pregnancy became simply necessary with an infant in the house. Sophia's nursery was equipped with monitoring systems and panic buttons. Her stroller was custom-built with reinforced panels, and every outing required advanced planning and multiple contingencies. The legitimate businesses that provided our public face became even more important as we sought to build a foundation that would allow Sophia to choose a different path when she was old enough to understand the complexities of her inheritance. When Sophia was 6 months old, Vincent made a decision that surprised even Marcus and Dante. He announced that he was stepping back from active leadership of the organization, transitioning to an advisory role that would allow him to focus more attention on our family while maintaining the influence necessary to protect our interests. It was a calculated risk that required careful negotiation with allies and rivals, a gradual transfer of power that maintained stability while reducing our direct exposure to the violence that accompanied territorial disputes and succession struggles. I supported the decision completely, understood that Vincent was choosing us over empire in ways that few men in his position would consider. We used the transition period to expand the legitimate businesses, acquiring properties and contracts that generated clean money and provided cover for the shadier operations that still required oversight. I found myself taking on more responsibility in these legal enterprises, my business background finally finding full expression as we built something that could sustain our lifestyle without requiring constant moral compromise. The threats did not disappear entirely, but they evolved into more subtle forms as Vincent's reduced profile made direct confrontation less attractive to potential enemies. We received offers to purchase our properties at below-market rates, experienced mysterious delays in permit approvals, dealt with suppliers who suddenly became unreliable for reasons they could not quite explain. But these were manageable problems, business challenges rather than existential threats, the kind of obstacles that could be addressed through lawyers and accountants rather than violence. Sophia's first birthday party was held in our garden on a perfect spring afternoon, attended by the inner circle and their families, Mrs. Chun and Dr. Martinez, and a few carefully vetted neighbors who had become genuine friends over the years. I watched Vincent push our daughter on the swing set he had installed himself, listened to her delighted laughter echoing across the lawn, and felt something settle in my chest that I had never experienced before. This was what peace felt like, I realized. Not the absence of danger, because that would never be completely possible in our world, but the presence of love strong enough to hold space for joy despite the shadows. As Sophia grew from infant to toddler, her personality emerged in ways that delighted and occasionally terrified us. She was fearless like her father, climbing furniture and exploring every corner of our property with determined curiosity. But she was also intuitive in ways that reminded me of the survival skills I had developed during my years with Tyler, reading emotions and responding to tension with precocious awareness. She adored Vincent absolutely, following him around the house chattering in her developing vocabulary, and he responded to her attention with patience and wonder that transformed him from the controlled man others knew into someone softer and more openly emotional. The legitimate businesses flourished under our joint management, real estate holdings, and security consulting contracts that generated substantial income while providing employment for former associates who wanted to transition away from more dangerous work. We created a scholarship fund for children from troubled backgrounds, established a foundation that supported domestic violence shelters, found ways to give back to communities that had been affected by the darker aspects of Vincent's former activities. It felt like penance and investment simultaneously, building goodwill and genuine positive impact, while creating the kind of public reputation that would serve Sophia well when she was old enough to understand her heritage. When Sophia turned 3, we faced our first real test of the new life we had built. A federal investigation into organized crime activities swept through the city, targeting current and former leaders with subpoenas and indictments that sent shockwaves through Vincent's old world. We spent sleepless weeks consulting with lawyers, reviewing records, preparing for the possibility that Vincent's past might finally catch up with him despite the careful distance he had maintained from active operations. But the transition had been thorough, the legitimate businesses genuinely clean, and Vincent's reduced profile worked in our favor as investigators focused on more active targets. We weathered the storm with minimal damage, a few uncomfortable interviews, and some frozen assets that were eventually returned, but nothing that threatened our family or our future. The experience reinforced our decision to continue moving away from the shadows, to build something sustainable and legal that would protect Sophia from the consequences of choices made before she was born. By the time Sophia started preschool, we had achieved something that would have seemed impossible during those early days when I delivered pizza to the wrong address and met a dangerous man who changed my life forever. We were a normal family, or as normal as possible given our complicated history. Vincent coached Sophia's soccer team. I volunteered at her school. We attended parent-teacher conferences and birthday parties and community events like any other suburban couple with a precocious daughter and a carefully constructed life. But we never forgot where we came from, never pretended that the love we had built together was simple or uncomplicated. Vincent still carried himself with the controlled power that marked him as someone not to be crossed, still maintained the connections and influence that ensured our safety in a world where debts and grudges had long memories. I still recognized the signs of danger in ways that other mothers at school pickup never would, still felt the old hypervigilance that had kept me alive during my darkest years. On quiet evenings when Sophia was asleep and we sat together in our living room, Vincent and I sometimes talked about the path that had brought us to this peaceful place. The pizza delivery that went wrong, the bruises that revealed more than I intended, the moment when a dangerous man decided to protect rather than exploit someone who needed help. We had built an empire of two that had grown to include the daughter who slept safely upstairs, surrounded by love and security and possibilities we were still learning to believe in. The future stretched ahead of us, uncertain but filled with promise, and we faced it together as we always had, as partners who had learned that love was not the absence of danger, but the presence of someone willing to stand beside you when the shadows gathered. Sophia would grow up knowing she was wanted and protected and cherished, would have choices we had never imagined possible when we first found each other in desperation and recognized something essential that transcended the circumstances that brought us together. I responded that I had found myself in his protection, discovered strength I had not known I possessed, and together we had built something real and lasting from the broken pieces we had both carried. Neither of us was perfect, and our life together would never be simple or safe. But we were perfect together in our imperfection, 3 people now instead of 2, a family forged in impossible circumstances but sustained by love that had proven stronger than fear, deeper than danger, more enduring than the violence that had once defined the boundaries of our world.